Hello. My presentation provides an overview of my mock research proposal, which uses a qualitative multiple case study designed to examine how repeated disaster-related fiscal stress affects the ability of rural fire departments to retain personnel. The title of my proposed research is Repeated Disaster-Related Fiscal Stress and Retention Capacity in Rural Fire Departments, a qualitative multiple case study. The primary objective of this project is to better understand the relationship between repeated disasters, financial strain, and workforce retention in rural fire service organizations. Rural fire departments are often expected to maintain emergency response capacity across large jurisdictions or geographic spaces with limited tax bases, volunteer dependent staffing models, and aging infrastructure, which is apparatus and stations. When repeated disasters occur, these departments may experience not only direct operational impacts, but also long-term fiscal stress that affects staffing, morale, recruitment, retention, and emergency readiness. My research question for this project is, how does repeated disaster-related fiscal stress affect the capacity of rural fire departments to retain firefighters and emergency personnel? The dependent variable in this study is retention capacity of rural fire departments. For the sake of the study, retention capacity is defined as an agency or department's ability to retain firefighters, EMS personnel, administrative staff, and volunteers. The primary independent variable is repeated disaster-related fiscal stress. This refers to the financial pressures caused or made worse by recurring disaster events. The pressures include things like repair costs, increased operational expenses, revenue disruptions, infrastructure damage, rising insurance costs, grant match burdens, and the diversion of funds away from staffing, training, equipment, and retention efforts. The anticipated theoretical significance of the study is that it connects several bodies of literature that are often discussed separately. So disaster management, public finance, rural public administration, emergency services staffing, and volunteer retention. Existing literature has addressed disaster impacts on local governments and has addressed staffing and volunteer challenges in emergency services, yet there's still a gap in understanding how repeated disaster-related fiscal stress specifically affects retention capacity in rural fire departments. This study seeks to fill that gap by examining the mechanisms by which fiscal stress becomes a workforce issue. The substantive significance of this study is also important. So rural fire departments provide essential public safety services, often in areas where residents face geographic isolation, with limited infrastructure, fewer public resources. And if repeated disasters weaken these departments' ability to retain personnel, then communities may experience longer response times, reduced emergency readiness, and greater vulnerability during future disasters. This research has direct implications for public policy through grant funding priorities and criteria, local government planning, hazard mitigation, and emergency services sustainability. My primary hypothesis is based on existing literature. Rural fire departments that have experienced repeated disaster-related fiscal stress will have lower retention capacity than rural fire departments that have experienced less disaster-related fiscal stress. A related hypothesis is the effect of disaster-related fiscal stress on retention capacity is likely to be strongest when departments have limited revenue diversity, aging facilities and apparatus, high volunteer dependence, and limited access to external funding. A third hypothesis is departments that use formal retention strategies, regional partnerships, grant funding opportunities, and long-term capital planning may be able to better reduce the negative impacts of repeated disaster-related fiscal stress on retention capacity. The dependent variable, which is retention capacity, will be conceptualized as the department's ability to maintain stable and operationally effective workforce. It'll be measured through several indicators, including firefighter and volunteer turnover, length of service, vacancy patterns, participation in training, ability to meet staffing requirements and minimum staffing, use of mutual and automatic aid to cover staffing gaps, and the perceptions from department leaders about workforce sustainability or stability. The independent variable is repeated disaster-related fiscal stress. It will be conceptualized as an ongoing or reoccurring financial pressure linked to disaster events. It'll be measured through indicators such as the number and frequency of disaster events affecting the jurisdiction, documented damages to agency facilities or equipment, repair and recovery costs, changes in operational budgets, failed or delayed capital projects, reliance on reserve funds, grant applications and awards, insurance costs and increases, and evidence that disaster recovery costs have displaced other department priorities. So this study will utilize a qualitative multiple case study research design. This is the most appropriate because the research question asks how the fiscal stress affects retention capacity. The study is not only asking whether the relationship exists, it's asking how that relationship happens, what mechanisms connect financial stress to staffing outcomes, and how departments leaders interpret and respond to these challenges. A qualitative multiple case study allows an in-depth exam of several rural fire departments that share some common characteristics but differ in disaster exposure, fiscal concerns, and retention outcomes. This design is appropriate because it allows for comparison across cases while still preserving context-specific details that are essential in rural emergency services. This case selection strategy is going to be purposeful. I would select 3 to 5 rural fire departments that have experienced repeated disaster impacts, with attention on the variation in related stress, fiscal stress, and retention capacity. For example, one case may involve a department that has experienced repeated flooding and significant financial strain. Another may involve a department affected by wildfire, severe storms, or other recurring hazards. A third case may involve a department that's faced repeated disaster exposure but has had more success in maintaining retention capacity. The goal is not random selection. Instead, the goal is theoretically informed case selection. The case should allow for comparison between departments that experience similar types of pressures but have different outcomes. This supports the use of comparative log, including the elements of Mills method. For example, if departments face similar disaster exposure but differ in retention capacity, the study can examine what organizational or fiscal factors may explain the difference. If departments differ in disaster frequency but show similar retention challenges, the study can then examine whether the fiscal stress operates through common mechanisms. So the data for the study would come from several sources. First, I would conduct semi-structured interviews with fire chiefs, administrative staff, training officers, union and volunteer association representatives where applicable, and firefighters or volunteers. These interviews would explore their perceptions of the disaster impacts, fiscal strain, morale, retention challenges, and organizational responses. Second, I would review department documents, including budgets, annual reports, staffing records, strategic plans, grant applications, and capital facility plans. I'd also look at levy or bond measures, disaster recovery documents, and meeting minutes. These documents would provide evidence of the financial stress, the staffing trends, and decision-making over time. Third, I would examine the publicly available documents about the disasters. So local government materials that include declarations, hazard mitigation plans, emergency management reports, and local government financial documents. These sources would help connect department-level experiences and perspectives to broader disaster and fiscal conditions. The data collection method I would use would begin with document review to establish the background for each case. I would then conduct the semi-structured interviews to collect detailed qualitative data from people with direct knowledge of the department's fiscal and workforce challenges. Interviews would be recorded and transcribed with participant knowledge and consent. The analysis would use thematic coding to identify recurring patterns across the cases. Initial codes may include fiscal stress, staffing instability, volunteer burnout, disaster recovery costs, infrastructure damage, grant dependence, morale, leadership strategies, and regional, mutual, and automatic aid reliance. The study would use cross-case comparison. So after each case is analyzed individually, I would compare patterns across all the cases to identify similarities, differences, and outliers. This would help determine whether repeated disaster-related fiscal stress appears to affect retention capacity through common mechanisms such as the reduced training investment, increased workload, delayed facility improvements, burnout, or uncertainty about the department's future. The observable implications of the study are important. If the theory is correct, I could expect to see several patterns. First, departments that experience repeated disaster-related fiscal stress should describe retention as more difficult over time. Second, budget documents should show evidence that disaster recovery or facility repair costs compete with staffing, training, equipment, and retention investments. Third, personnel may describe increased burnout, frustration, anxiety, or uncertainty when disasters repeatedly disrupt operations or delay improvements. Fourth, departments with stronger fiscal planning, regional partnerships, or access to grant funding may show resilience in maintaining retention capacity. And then fifth, departments with limited reserves, aging facilities, apparatus, and equipment, and heavy volunteer dependence may show greater retention vulnerability. So these observable implications are not simply just changes in the variables. These are the real-world patterns that we should be able to see if the proposed causal relationship is operating as expected. So the justification for using a qualitative multiple case study design is grounded in the nature of the research question. This project seeks to understand a complex organization and policy problem that cannot be fully captured through numerical data alone. Retention capacity isn't just a count of staffing. It's shaped by morale, leadership, organizational culture, fiscal uncertainty, community expectations, and repeated operational disruption. A qualitative study design allows the study to capture those mechanisms. This approach also aligns with the logic of research and design as involved in our course readings from KKV and their emphasis on connecting research questions, theory, observable implications, and evidence. The research design follows those research questions. Because my research question asks how fiscal stress affects retention capacity in a specific organizational context, a qualitative comparative design is more appropriate than a large and statistical design at this stage. A quantitative design could identify broad correlations between disaster frequency and staffing trends, but may not explain how these effects occur inside rural fire departments. A quasi-experimental design may be useful in future research, especially if reliable longitudinal staffing and budget data are available across departments. But for this project, a qualitative multiple case study is the best design for theory building and mechanism identification. So the strengths of my research design include that it allows for deep contextual analysis. Rural fire departments work in very different financial, geographic, political, and organizational environments. A multiple case study allows me, the researcher, to examine these details rather than treating all the departments the same. A second strength is that the design supports comparison. By looking at more than one case, the study can identify patterns that appear across departments and distinguish those patterns from issues that may be unique to one agency. A third strength is that the design has strong policy relevance. Interviews and documents can reveal the practical realities behind retention problems, including barriers that may not appear in formal data sets. This design also has weaknesses. One is limited generalizability. Because this study examines a small number of cases, the findings cannot automatically be applied to every rural fire department. To address this, the study will use careful case selection, transparent criteria, and detailed case descriptions so readers can evaluate whether the findings may transfer to similar contexts. A second weakness is the potential for research bias, especially because my professional experience informs my interest in this topic. To mitigate this, I would use reflexive memoing, a clear coding process, triangulation across interviews and documents, and carefully separating between professional experience and empirical evidence. A third weakness is the possibility of incomplete or inconsistent data across departments. Some departments may not have detailed records. So to address this, the study will have to rely on multiple data sources and will avoid making claims that are not supported by sufficient evidence. A fourth weakness is that the interview participants may describe events differently based on their role, their memory, or their personal experience. But this can be mitigated by interviewing participants in different positions and comparing interview data with documented evidence. So the practical policy implications for this study is if repeated disaster-related fiscal stress weakens retention capacity, then public policy should not treat disaster recovery and staffing as separate issues. Funding programs, hazard mitigation grants, state support, local government planning, all of these should recognize that repeated disasters can produce long-term workforce consequences. The findings may support policy recommendations, and it could improve outcomes for rural departments facing repeated disaster impacts. At the same time, the study's generalizability must be stated carefully. So the findings would be most applicable to rural fire departments with similar characteristics, but the findings may be less applicable to large urban fire departments with broader revenue streams, larger staffing pools, and more specialized administrative support. Biblical principles also influence this proposal. So public service, stewardship, justice, and caring for vulnerable communities are all relevant to the study. 1 Corinthians 4:2 says that stewards must be found faithful, which supports the responsibility of public agencies to manage limited resources wisely. Proverbs 27:12 teaches us that prudent people sees danger and takes refuge, which connects directly to disaster preparedness and hazard mitigation and long-term planning for rural fire departments. And John 15:13 illustrates the sacrificial nature of emergency services, reminding us that it's our job to serve our communities by accepting the risk on behalf of others. So together, these principles support the importance of studying how rural fire departments can remain financially stable, adequately staffed, and prepared to protect vulnerable communities during repeated disasters. So in closing, this proposed study examines how repeated disasters how disaster-related fiscal stress affects the retention capacity of rural fire departments. The research question focuses on policy-relevant problems at the intersection of disaster management, public finance, and emergency services staffing. The dependent variable is retention capacity, and the primary independent variable is repeated disaster-related fiscal stress. A qualitative multiple case study is the most appropriate research design because it allows for a detailed analysis of causal mechanisms, organizational context, and practical decision making. The design will also allow for comparison across multiple rural fire departments while acknowledging the complexity of local conditions. Thank you.